This week on the It's a Monkey podcast.
I think that we are going to run into a situation where it's likely that there simply aren't enough jobs out there, especially for people of, more average capability. And at that point, we have to consider a more radical solution. Education isn't going to cut it. And I think that something along the lines of a guaranteed income where everyone in society has access to at least a minimum livable income may be the way we need to go.
Thank you for listening to the It's a Monkey podcast. We are taking a couple of weeks break over the Easter holiday in Australia. We'll be back in a week or two with some live podcasts, but in the meantime, we're going to be playing you some fantastic repeat shows of previous podcasts that we know you will enjoy. Thank you for listening to the It's a Monkey podcast. You're back with It's a Monkey podcast, where we talk about everything relating to tech, the tech economy, the impact of technological advancements. And we like to think of ourselves at ManageFlitter as a bit of a philosophical bunch. And one of the topics that rears its head very, very regularly is talking about robots and artificial intelligence, and when robots would wake up. And we have these team lunches where there's intense debate and there's different schools of thought of when robots are going to wake up, the impact, etc. So I was very excited the other day to stumble upon a book called The Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of the Jobless Future. And I'm very excited to say I've managed to get the author of that book, Martin Ford, who's also based in Silicon Valley, a tech entrepreneur who wrote that book, at the end of my Skype line to join us on the podcast. Martin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Martin, firstly, this isn't your first book around this area. What led you to your interest in this particular area of tech and tech advancement?
Well, I wrote my first book on this about 5 years ago, and the thing that kind of got me thinking about it is that I've run a small software business in Silicon Valley, and I've seen the impact on that business. I mean, when I started in the mid-1990s, software was a pretty labor-intensive business. You needed people to produce physical media, because software was shipped on CD-ROMs, and then there were people to pack all of that up into physical packages that were sent off to customers. And really within just a few years, all of that kind of evaporated. And now, of course, software is delivered electronically or it's just hosted in the cloud. And so a lot of jobs for what you might think of as average people in the software business have just kind of disappeared. And I sort of viewed that as a preview of what was coming for the entire economy as artificial intelligence and robotics really sort of gain traction.
And I believe these days they're robots that fix themselves. So if there's something, if they have a proverbial screw loose or they need a part that replaces, they can actually self-amend themselves. So they don't even need the humans to maintain those robots anymore.
Right. To some extent, that's becoming true, not just in terms of robots, but in terms of everything. One of the big trends we're going to be looking at is the Internet of Things, where everything is sort of connected and able to communicate. And you're increasingly going to see, smart diagnostic algorithms operating across all these systems that really allow them to sort of maintain themselves. So one of the myths out there is that if we have lots of robots, there'll be huge numbers of jobs for people to fix the robots. And I'm afraid that's kind of wishful thinking.
Okay, so explain to me, in our industry, I'm also a tech entrepreneur. One of the, if not the biggest challenge we currently face is a skills shortage. And one of the arguments you make in your book is that even professionals such as lawyers and software developers will be impacted by these advancements. Currently, there seems to be a really big gap between those two scenarios. Fill me in on how you see that gap's actually going to shrink and totally actually the playing field totally change.
Well, first of all, it's possible for a shortage of people with very specific skills and capabilities to coexist with a general slack in the market for more average people. And I think that's the kind of the future we're moving toward. You can't take all of the average people out there and train them all to be data scientists or to have some very specific skill levels. So that's one of the problems we face. But beyond that, it's also true that smart algorithms, especially in areas like machine learning, are starting at least to some extent to encroach on more skilled jobs. And we see plenty of examples of that already in terms of like lawyers, paralegals are being impacted by smart algorithms that can do document review. We see journalism being impacted by algorithms that are capable of generating at least basic news stories, especially in areas like sports reporting and business reporting. So I think that as we look toward the future, there will be a larger and larger impact on people that do have relatively high skill levels. In other words, people who have graduated from college and so forth.
I think a lot of people don't realize that some of the reports that they're reading in finance and sports are actually generated by a computer.
That's right. Some of the main media companies are using these technologies, and a lot of them are not eager to disclose that fact. They don't really want people to know that a lot of their stories are generated autonomously. But it is a growing trend. And right now it is primarily more formulaic type stories in areas like financial reporting and so forth. But the technology is getting better and better. It already goes way beyond simply being able to plug numbers into some completely standard format. I mean, it's already much smarter than that, and it's going to get better and better.
I want to cover shortly some of the impacts on capitalism as a sort of framework that you speak about. But before that, one of the questions that we like to philosophize on internally is, and I would like your opinion on it, is when do you feel that robots will wake up? When will they get self-awareness? Is it something that may happen within the next 5 years, or is it still hundreds of years away?
I think it's fairly far out. Certainly, I would be extremely surprised if it happened in anything like the next 5 to 10 years. You have heard some very high-profile people sort of warning us of the implications of that, particularly Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk and so forth have been worrying a lot about superintelligent machines and how they may threaten humanity. And I don't think that that's a ridiculous concern that we should completely dismiss, but I do think that it's pretty far out. I mean, it's probably 20, 30 years at a minimum away. I think that what we see are these people, giving us these warnings are really smart, accomplished people, but they're not actually working in artificial intelligence research. And if you talk to the people actually working on the problem, they're a bit more humble in terms of, how far we are along with that. So I think that's pretty far out.
I mean, when that does happen, and I believe, and I'm sort of a punter, so to speak. I don't have any particular expertise in the area, but I just more just based on the fact of the rate that technology compounds, and I just feel that eventually, the mere processing power, the machines will wake up. I mean, it's obviously going to be a very significant cultural, social impact on society if machines actually get self-awareness of any significant sort of degree.
Yeah, I mean, if that happens, if machines become self-aware and they become as smart or likely much smarter than human beings, then I mean, as Stephen Hawking said, that would be the biggest thing that has ever happened in history. And I think that's probably right. I mean, that would be just an enormously disruptive change. For one thing, just minimally, I mean, essentially all the jobs would go away at that point. I mean, even the very smartest people with the highest level of education wouldn't be competitive with super intelligent machines. So, I mean, it would have a fantastic impact on employment. But of course, beyond that, there's the question of whether the machines might actually threaten us or take over. And those are real risks at that point. There's no doubt, even though it sounds very far-fetched and it's something that has been explored in lots of science fiction novels and movies, and therefore it sounds kind of crazy and it's easy to laugh at it. At that point, it would be a real concern, no doubt about it.
Well, before we go, I mean, instead of going down that slightly further down that track, let's talk about what you speak a little bit more about in your book of professionals like lawyers or journalists being impacted. And you argue that this, will drive income inequality, and you propose some sort of some remedies, some sort of changes to the capitalist framework to actually address these. Talk us through some of your thoughts around that.
Well, the traditional solution to the impact of technology on the job market has always been education. The idea is if automation or robots take your low-skill job, then you should go back to school or get some more training, and then you can move up the skills ladder. I think that we're kind of running into the end game on that for two reasons. One is that there's a limit to the capability of the average person. Not everyone can train to be, a PhD level data scientist or something that requires really an incredible amount of skill and creativity and so forth. And the second problem, as I pointed out, is that these machines are increasingly coming after many of those skilled jobs. In fact, it turns out that if you've got a relatively routine white collar job where you're sitting in front of a computer doing the same kinds of things, manipulating information again and again, that job may actually be easier to automate than someone who's got a low skill job that actually requires, physically manipulating the environment. You don't need any expensive robots and so forth to do it at that point. So I think that we are going to run into a situation where it's likely that there simply aren't enough jobs out there, especially for people of, more average capability. And at that point, we have to consider a more radical solution. Education isn't going to cut it. And I think that something along the lines of a guaranteed income where everyone in society has access to at least a minimum livable income may be the way we need to go. And there will be really two reasons for that. The first is that, of course, people have to survive economically. And the second thing is that we need people to be consumers. We need people that are capable of buying the products and services that are produced by the economy. If we don't have that, then there's a real to capitalism and to economic growth and to the viability of our economy as it exists today. We need people to actually drive the economy by being able to buy the things that are produced.
How's the tax base going to support that? And how practically do you see this actually as playing out?
Well, at the moment, it's not very practical. I mean, it's certainly in the United States where, we're more conservative than probably Australia and certainly more than a lot of European countries. It's almost unthinkable that we could have this kind of a solution. But that's the paradox. I think that it's, in one sense, almost unthinkable that we could do this. And on the other side of that is that it at some point becomes inevitable that I think we will have to do it. So I'm not sure exactly how that plays out. In terms of how you pay for it, obviously it would require higher taxes. Part of that would be more progressive taxes because we are seeing continuing inequality where all the income is really concentrating at the top in the hands of just a few wealthy people. And those are the people that are capitalists and in effect own the machines. And that's something that I likely think will continue and get worse and worse. And so we're simply going to have to figure out a way to tax those people and get some of that money so we can recirculate it. I think that there are other opportunities for other kinds of tax as well. A carbon tax might be one obvious thing that we should be doing anyway and would be one way to raise some revenue. So I think that there are a variety of taxation schemes there, but ultimately we're going to have to look at that in order to sort of make this work going forward.
I mean, it's an issue that gets spoken about a lot in Australia with our shrinking tax base, aging population, massive healthcare costs, and trying to get the books to balance gets harder and harder every year. So we lucky we don't have the sort of income inequality that seems to be more prevalent in the US, but we certainly, our tax base is under a lot of pressure, and there's even talk that eventually our nationalized healthcare scheme will implode.
Right. But you see, the problem is that the tax base is dependent on a vibrant economy. So if you get into a situation where there aren't enough people out there to drive the economy, to keep buying the things produced, then, that ultimately will, of course, threaten the tax base as well, because that's, where it all comes from. So it's really important to keep that cycle going, to make sure that the people at the bottom of the income distribution have also got access to a reasonable income so that they can continue to act as consumers.
And that's one of the arguments for having a high minimum wage. And one of the arguments why Australia has been quite successful, even despite a high minimum wage, is the people with the high minimum wage, guess what they do with that high minimum wage? They spend it and it puts it back into the economy and it keeps on going. Whereas a low minimum wage, it's just sort of a bit of a race to the bottom and they don't have anything to spend and it actually gums up the economy and slows it down.
That's right. The problem with that going forward, of course, is that if the jobs are increasingly automated, then a minimum wage won't solve the problem. In fact, in some cases, it may worsen the problem because it increases the incentive for innovation. So that's why I think that in the future we may have to move away from having a minimum wage in terms of what's paid to employees and instead have a minimum income.
So tell us, if someone listening, I'm sure one of they're very intrigued by what robots are capable of these days. Give us a couple of examples of the journalist stories, writing stories is the one example. What are some other interesting areas where robots are getting involved that people might not be aware of? I think I saw a video the other day in Japan of some nurse type robot in the hospital there.
Right. There are lots of innovations happening. I mean, eldercare, the idea of healthcare and eldercare, taking care of older people is one area that has, tremendous potential. It's an area where we really need robots because, almost every industrialized society is seeing huge costs from an aging population. Unfortunately, it's really a challenge because in order to do that, you need a robot that's just got extraordinary dexterity and flexibility and so forth. So we're seeing some sort of baby steps in that area. Where we're really seeing a lot of progress, of course, is one area is self-driving cars. I mean, we're just seeing a terrific amount of progress there. And if those become viable, then that's directly going to threaten millions and millions of jobs for professional drivers, potentially. Actually, driving vehicles is the most common occupation for men in the United States. So,
wow.
I mean, if all those jobs go away,
huh.
that's a big problem, obviously. There's a company here in Silicon Valley that I mentioned in my book that has built a robot specifically geared toward loading and unloading boxes. And this is a robot with machine vision that can look at a stack of boxes and figure out how to, pick up the boxes and move them just as a human worker would. And this is really something that's quite new. I mean, robots in factories and so forth have been around for a long time, but generally they've been really dependent on precise positioning and timing. In other words, they're kind of tightly choreographed. They depend on a factory where everything is timed exactly and they can move things and do things that are precisely repetitive. But as soon as you get into a situation that's unpredictable, where you've got to use vision and hand-eye coordination to do things, then the robots have really fallen short. But we're now seeing real progress in that area. And this system that can actually load and unload boxes based on machine vision is one good example of that, of how the robots are really pushing into areas that simply haven't been accessible to this technology before. And that's going to continue to accelerate. And I mean, it's ultimately, I think, going to be a huge number of jobs that are impacted, both blue collar jobs that are impacted by actual robots and white collar jobs that are impacted by smart algorithms, like the examples I gave in the area of law and journalism and so forth. So this is just a big wave of disruption that I think is going to unfold probably over the next 10 to 20 years.
So if someone's listening to the podcast and maybe they're parents or someone's about to head into university, what what area of study or skills could they perhaps head to if they do have the choice to perhaps insulate themselves or protect themselves? Obviously, there's lots of unpredictability in the world, but are there any obvious areas that could definitely never be replaced or under threat, even from smart machine learning or latest robotic innovations?
There's nothing that would never be threatened. I mean, there's nothing that's completely safe forever. I mean, as we were saying earlier, people worry about the fact that the machines are going to wake up and become super intelligent. I mean, if that happens, then clearly nothing is safe. For the foreseeable future, I think healthcare is certainly one good area, especially if you're working in an area like nursing where you interact directly with patients and it needs lots of dexterity and mobility and so forth. That's an area that's very hard to automate. So I think that for the foreseeable future, jobs in that area and similarly in medicine and doctors that require that kind of interaction are probably relatively safe. In general, I think that if you're starting out and you're thinking of educating yourself, you want to get as much education as you can. It's better to study a technical field than to not do so. But the main thing would be to be flexible, to learn how to learn and to expect that in the future, whatever you start out doing is likely going to evaporate at some point, and you may have to switch to something else. I mean, that's kind of easy advice to give. The reality is that for many people, it's not easy to make that transition, especially if it occurs beyond a certain age. When people get older, it's harder and harder for them to transition into something new. So, that's good advice, but we should also understand as a society that a lot of people will probably have great difficulty making this kind of transition. And that's one of the reasons I think that we're going to need, new, more radical policies, perhaps something like a guaranteed income eventually.
Change is hard, as the cab drivers in Paris a little while ago definitely made very clear when they caused a riot after the entry of Uber X, or which I'm not sure what they called it, their Uber Pop or something like that.
That's right. And that's sort of a preview of what may be coming. And that's, just Uber. But imagine what it's going to be like when Uber's cars are self-driving and there's no human beings involved at all. Then I mean, it's going to be even more dramatic. And what we're really seeing is that kind of impact really across the board, not just in driving jobs, not just in any one industry, but really much more broad-based than that. And that's why I think that, we really are going to have to start to think about this and have a conversation about it, because we could be looking at a very significant disruption going forward.
So how do we know that you're not just a smart algorithm, Martin?
Well, at this point, you can be pretty safe that I'm not, I think. But 20 years from now, who knows? I might be a machine that's talking to you.
So I believe you're coming to, you're going to be visiting Sydney for the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, which is happening, I believe, just on a week at the Sydney Opera House.
That's right. It's September 5th and 6th, and I'm going to be speaking there about all of this, and there'll be lots of other good speakers too. So, I think it will be a really terrific opportunity. It'll be my first time in Sydney, so I'm very excited about it.
Fantastic! It's a brilliant city, and spring is on the way. And I've been to that festival before, and I might head down if some of the tickets aren't sold out. And it's they intentionally try to have a bit of provocative topics and discussions, and it's no better location in the world. So I hope you'll enjoy it.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Martin, thank you very much for joining us on the It's a Monkey podcast. Martin Ford is the author of Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future. You can get it on Amazon, Kindle, etc., etc. We'll put a link on the show notes. And interesting future ahead, Martin, and maybe we'll touch base in a couple of years, and we'll see how the progress is going.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks again for having me.